Media research methods. Assignment 1, interview. That's great. So, your initial introduction to radio?
Yeah, I think my initial introduction to radio was visiting friends who lived on the dairy farm near us.
In Swan Hill?
Phillips in Swan Hill. Captain Phillips had been a sailing ship captain, and he'd retired from sailing and bought a dairy farm. Mum and Dad were friendly with them, and they had 2 sons, and we used to go to visit them, and one son had an amateur radio station. He was very keen on radio, and I suppose we would have been in our very early teen years when we went there.
Yep.
And Jack Phillips had a call sign VK3CD, and he communicated by Morse code with other amateur radio operators throughout the world, actually.
Would that have been a crystal set or a...
He had a battery-powered set, and he made our first crystal set, which we used as our domestic radio at home, which was called a cat's whisker crystal, that you fiddled this very fine piece of spring wire to make contact on a piece of quartz crystal, and you wore headphones and you could get a message through the radio, not too far distant at that time, but that was our introduction to radio. And Jack used Morse code, and he had call sign cards from people wherever he contacted them. They used to exchange their cards, and he was lining his shack, as they had the habit of calling their rooms. I might mention inside the house they really had a radio that worked. And
so how far away would he be able to...
Well, he was extending his activity to well outside Australia by the time, I suppose, in the very early 30s. And later on he was even experimenting with television, a series of spinning perforated wheels, battery operated, and could listen to it with a headphone operated radio. I made a crystal set when I was at school because I had a friend who was interested in radio, or wireless as we called it then. I sold it for 3 shillings, which was the equivalent of 30 cents without the headphone. I think I could draw the diagram of the circuitry of it now if I had to.
Are they hard? How long would it take you to make?
You'd make one in half an hour.
Really?
As, you'd have to erect a fairly good aerial to pick up the signals that came through. But the set itself was very, very simple.
Compared to something like this?
Oh yes, it would be very small. I made one once in the matchbox, and the variation to tune the stations depended on the inside of the matchbox with a coil wound round it, sliding in and out the box, which had a coil around the outside of the box itself, and that gave you the tuning effect.
Yep.
You could do all sorts of funny things with crystal sets, but their range wasn't very great. So we progressed from listening to the cricket, one hand over your ear and telling everybody to be quiet while you listen, to battery operated with a horn type speaker, which that had. It was a wonderful means of communication because you could, at the end of your day's work, you could sit down and tune in. Different hours of the day, the signal would vary in strength depending largely on the weather or atmospheric conditions. But you could get the daily news.
Yeah, what other types? Is that what you got, just news? Did they have soap operas back?
Eventually
back then,
they did, yes. A lot of the radio stations were only on certain hours of the day. At the end of the day, they'd come on, particularly on sale days, they'd come on for market reports.
Oh, you were saying about that, weren't you, about how...
And the clerks from the various stock agents would go to the local radio station and read the market reports for the day. And it had its social implications, whereas the farmers would be able to hear what the market had been like, and rather than phone the individual sellers, they'd tune into the market report and hear how well they'd done during the day. It had some useful implications that way.
So in your family, I don't know, did you all sit around and listen to it together, like it was like we do with the TV?
Yes, particularly around the open, which went by the range increased, the physical range increased, and the range of program types increased. We could have play readings. We used to do play readings which was about the scenery. You simply did the reading into the microphone.
Did you do that at school or?
We did it as a group after our school days,
Oh, really?
actually.
So that was when you were a teenager? How old would you have been?
Oh, late teenage, really, for us then.
Did you, things like Orson Welles, he used to have plays.
Yeah.
And did you listen to War of the Worlds when that was on?
Yes, we listened to that. We listened to some lighter things.
Were you one of the people that thought it was real?
You
War
could
of the
think it
Worlds,
was
or
real.
did you hear the whole thing?
No,
The whole play?
not the whole play. I'm trying to think of a particular one that went on for a very light entertainment.
Yep.
And it's just the background noises would give a sort of a realistic effect to the play. When the sport was being broadcast, for clapping or for applause, they'd often shake sand onto like a drum-tight surface on something.
Oh, really?
And this would give you the impression of a loud clapping applause. And some fellows became expert at sound effects in the background.
Oh, really?
It,
I guess they wouldn't have had the equipment to actually
Ah.
record the
no.
real crowd with it, just make
No,
it
they
up.
you couldn't get the real crowd effect, but they could create them, and you'd get the applause. It was often tapping on things, or running their fingers over tight surface, or crumpling paper. It's amazing all the noises they became very expert in making. Yes, and radio then developed. It was good social contact, a good means of communication. There were no TV screens, although there were newsreels,
Yep.
and you could have a newsreel backed up with a commentary in the early lettograph type of shows.
So when you were a teenager, would they have had a cinema in Swan Hill? Could you go and
Yes,
see?
you could go to the
and see
pictures.
films?
I remember going to the very first one in the old town hall, and it was Steele Rudd's Story of Dad and Dave, and it was an amazing picture show. Of course, it was improved on the style, the movement, the Stilton type of movement.
Yep.
It's amusing when you look back at it now, but in those days, you just took it as real, and it was very, very good. In radio, battery types, there was no electricity in the country where we lived, so we had to use car-type batteries, we call them. There was a wet battery which you could have charged up whenever it went flat,
Oh, yeah.
and then there was a dry battery because they serviced different segments of the valves and different parts of the equipment. So you were out of communication when the battery went flat, unless you could afford two batteries, or took the battery out of the motor car and put it in the wireless.
So when did you get electricity?
Our particular farm was very late getting electricity. Because, there was a local electrical plant in the town, Swan Hill, which lasted until just after the war years. A very good generating plant. Following a big fire, the State Electricity Commission then came in and took over the circuit.
So the electrical radios were the same, though? Is the basically
Electrical
the same
were
as
the same as the
battery
batteries,
operated,
yes. They had a different valve, different voltage supply, but the same principle.
Did you want to talk about, I wanted to ask before you went to the war, before you decided to go into the Air Force, if you saw anything in the media about it. Did they have things on the radio about the army,
yes.
or asking
There were
people to
recruiting
campaigns and things?
My initial interest in the Air Force was generated at the country show where some Aberranson aircraft came up and flew very low, and then that was, I suppose that interest was followed up with radio recruiting campaigns, commentaries, and a couple of local people. The radio friend Jack Phillips was a pilot, although we never went flying with him. He was in the very early Air Force years. One of the local garage proprietors, Alan Danoon, was an amateur pilot or a private pilot. So he sort of kept the idea of flying alive in the town and his flying activities. Kingsford Smith came up in my high school years, and he gave joy flight rides about. At 2 and 6 or 25 cents per person. I thought it was too dear when my two older brothers had their ride, so I saw Kingsford Smith, I touched the Southern Cross and kept it in mind that someday, yes, I'd have an opportunity. And then when I got the opportunity of joining the Air Force, I knew nothing about mechanics or aerobatics. I was a pretty good shot with a shotgun. We'd been taught how to shoot. And I'd made a couple of crystal sets. So naturally, my inclination was towards radio and gunnery. And that's what I was chosen to do.
So did the Air Force come around to your town at all recruiting?
Yes, they came around recruiting and they appointed a local recruiting committee.
So did they do things like, did they have things coming over the radio, or did they put posters up, or how did that do?
They would have adverts
in
about
the newspapers and
recruiting and news items. Yes, we used to get news over the radio, but this time we had a battery operated radio. Propaganda, of course, benefits from radio.
Yep.
And I suppose radio and wireless from propaganda because it's got something that people really want to hear about.
This article that I read, I'll show that to you later, was about the propaganda in World War II, about how the news bulletins differed in the different countries. Did you find that when you were you listening to news bulletins from other different countries? Did you notice discrepancies in, whether they were just talking in here about bombings like certain ship? On the Japanese radio, they'd report saying that, 2,000 Americans have been killed, and then on American or Australian radio, they'd say no Americans were killed, but so many Japanese were killed. Did you find?
Yes, that's right. There's a big discrepancy, and of course the truth's the greatest casualty, particularly in wartime. And radio reports are designed to feed the mood of the people who listen to them. They don't broadcast much bad news. It's used to excite people into patriotic activities, and they don't always broadcast the proper list of casualties or positions of troops and this sort of thing.
So did you find, because you were inside the Air Force, did you find out things that just normal civilians wouldn't have known?
We did sometimes.
Or did you find more of the truth?
Although even in the forces with radio, we didn't get fed all the news. Lots of things happened that we had learned about later that weren't really publicised at the time.
So you were being told just the good news basically as well?
Mostly, yes. You see, like during some of our training along the East Coast, a lot of submarine activity that was never publicised. And whilst it was there to be publicised, it deliberately wasn't. Otherwise you upset the morale. So good news on radio is a morale booster. It's a good means of communication, but it also can be manipulated. And I think the public's often manipulated by radio reporting.
And you were saying about how you used to write down the lists of the prisoners that were taken. Where did you hear? What radio was that on?
That's when we were in New Guinea, and we had big shortwave radios for communication purposes, not like the aircraft radios themselves, which are comparatively small. But in our off-duty time, quite a few of us used to sit and listen to a lady called Surabaya Sue, who was a Japanese a propagandist who would broadcast lists of prisoners who had been captured and broadcast their names, and we'd write down as would be quoted in the broadcast to tell them what we'd heard, because the general public possibly wouldn't have radios tuned to the frequencies that the Japanese were using. And hopefully by that way we could get them up to date with the situation with their family members. One of our pilot's brother was captured, and he was used to broadcast on behalf of the Japanese. They often did this at risk of their lives if they didn't. So
what kind of things did they have to say?
Well, they would try and talk down the courage of the troops that were listening to them, feed information about their captors, which sort of made the troops perhaps a little bit nervous sometimes. Fortunately, it didn't do that to many of them, but it was designed to break down the morale of the forces.
So did who was it? Whose brother?
Our pilot.
Your pilot brother. Did you talk to him about it at all? Like, or did he say that he was made to do it? Like,
No, well, we never had contact with him. I don't know what happened to him after the war. Possibly he came back home. They lived in Perth, and whether the family came back together again or whether they felt that he had been a traitor. He may not have intended to be a traitor. He might have been forced at the risk of his life to do what he was doing, which many people did have to do through fear. They would do what they were told to do. And radio, of course, that way was a great communicator. Good news and bad would communicate as quickly by.
Did you have much communication with your family while you were away? Were you still writing to them?
Oh, yes.
Regularly? So did they say anything about, did they ever write you letters saying, oh look, we've heard this over the radio,
not
was
in
it
my
true,
case.
or they weren't?
No, because your mail was always heavily censored, and both mail outward and inward would be censored. I would have lots of the letters from home that were written to me during the war as...
So, used. What did they listen to private radio or commercial radio stations to the news?
I would think so, yes, to pick up the news so they could perhaps ridicule it or, what shall I say, use it against the troops, and they would broadcast for the general public, if they could, misinformation. They listened also to service broadcasts. They could interfere with the broadcast. They could interrupt a broadcast, or they could get prior information of something that was going to happen by breaking into the frequency range that the different services used.
Where you were stationed at any time, like in New Guinea, did they ever have anyone near you monitoring the radio? Like, did you ever use radio to find out what was happening, or how did you find out? Were you radioed by people like in New Guinea, like to say, where you had to go? How did they find out things like that?
We had to, in the aircraft itself, you normally had to maintain radio silence, but you had your base to communicate was a sense by its frequencies to break in to try and pick up. But that was done by the intelligence arms of the various services, and they would break down codes, know what was happening. We sent messages often by Morse code, in code. I remember one occasion, this was during training, we were flying from one station to another, and I couldn't decipher the message that I got. We used to have to use a mechanical code breaker, which was a perforated sheet that you slipped over your other sheet, and you could then translate it. On this occasion, we got instructions not to land at a particular airport, and we were circling it ready to land, and I couldn't work out the code. Eventually, we got the sheets to fit together, and the code simply said, "Do not land at so-and-so." The pilot had to put his wheels up and go around, go home. It was one of our training flights. So each one would do to the best of their ability to break down the other side's code so they could interpret their messages.
I wonder if the news bulletins had any impact on what they were doing. I guess they probably would have found out. They could have found out some information.
Yes, they would interrupt broadcasts that either side felt detrimental to their morale, the troops' morale.
Did you notice a difference in the radio whether in Australia and New Guinea? Did you listen to radio stations like at ones that were broadcast from New Guinea?
In New Guinea, only had service radio stations. I don't think there were any commercial radio stations in that area.
So you couldn't get news bulletins that were broadcast from New Guinea?
No.
Pick them up from...
I don't think there would be any, apart from the intelligence listening posts that could pick up any of the broadcasts.
When you were talking about that show before, the Japanese one, that you used to write down the lists of...
The names of the prisoners.
Yeah, what else did they do on that show? Was that...
It was all propaganda, talking about what they intended to do.
It was aimed at a Japanese audience?
It was aimed at the Japanese audience to boost their morale. Yep. It was aimed at the Australians' audience to disinter morale. But it was a morale booster to some extent to the families of the people who were prisoners, to know, yes, they're still alive, yes, they're being used to promote the other side's story. So it had a dual purpose, but the Japanese intended it to break down the morale of the Australians.
Did it have any effect on you?
We felt that we were doing some good listening to it by communicating what we heard to the families, to the people. It wasn't secret information. We were allowed to do that. We could write to them.
Yep.
And usually we'd write that night to whatever names and addresses we'd got and say, we heard this.
Did you ever get replies from people?
Yeah, we did get some replies.
So do you think if your mail was sent, would they have, did they always send those letters, or?
Oh yes, the only thing that would be taken out of your letters might be something that was considered to be critical.
So they'd just cross it out, would they?
They'd cut it out. I had a term where I did censorship of mail that was going out.
Yep.
Some of it had to be cut out because people may not intend to give away critical information. They may not have recognised that it was critical information. But censorship was very important.